Vic, what events in your history led you to become a behavior analyst?
It's a short question, but a long answer is necessary. I went to graduate school. I was an undergraduate at Tufts College, and then went to graduate school at the University of Rochester. And I was interested in social psychology. It was only, and I wound up doing my dissertation on the effects of sleep deprivation and drugs on social behavior of groups of 4 undergraduates solving problems. It was only during that time when I was doing my dissertation that I read Science and Human Behavior, which came out in 1953 by Skinner. And that was an interesting book. I didn't understand much of it. After I finished my dissertation, I went to Brown University on a Ford Foundation teaching internship. They were trying to introduce freshmen and sophomores to science and other subjects by putting them in contact with the greats of the field. In the case of psychology, the two greats were Freud and Pavlov. The program didn't work out completely in the first semester because giving undergraduates stuff by Freud didn't work out. Pavlov, again, was impenetrable. Even I didn't understand much of what he was doing. But the second semester was devoted to the Keller and Schoenfeld laboratory, which they had set up at Columbia a few years before. And Harold Schlossberg, the head of the department at Brown, was very interested in Skinner. And Carl Fachman, one of the senior professors at Brown, was also. So this was a situation where the undergraduates were given in pairs a rat, a box, some Rice Krispies, a little chute that would be tiltable, and they had to train their rat. We went through Keller and Schoenfeld's book, Principles of Behavior, during that semester. I was 1 or 2 lessons ahead, chapters ahead of the student in going through the book, but it was an eye-opener. I finally discovered what psychology was all about. I went off to a job because of the background in working on drugs in my dissertation, I got a job at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. And in the fall of 1955, went off to Hopkins to work in the Division of Clinical Pharmacology. Again, this piece had nothing to do with operant behavior. I was with a very fine gentleman named Louis Lasagna, and who had been had an interest in working on the placebo effect, and I was supposed to be working on that. After a few months there, actually the first study I wound up doing was on the effects of meprobamate, Milltown, Ecbanel, which had just been introduced to the market and was a big seller. The effects of that on anxiety. I produced anxiety by putting people into a Ferris wheel, and they spun around in the Ferris wheel. It was, I got involved in this because I had a girlfriend with whom I went to Revere Beach near Boston. I went on a Ferris wheel ride, and it occurred to me that being thrown down toward the ground was just what Watson did to produce anxiety. And so anyway, we did an experiment on the effects of a drug on a Ferris wheel ride. I took data such as essentially how scared are you at this. They held a 3x5 card that actually made it a rating. This again was not very close to behavior analysis. In the second year at Hopkins, we moved into a new building. By that time, a colleague, a graduate student at Rochester, named Bernie Weiss, who had been at the School of Aviation Medicine for 2 years, joined me at Hopkins. He had some experience in animal behavior. I had none as a graduate student. Together we wound up going over to see Joe Brady at Walter Reed in an effort to learn more about the equipment and so on, which was just then being devised in large measure by people like Foringer. We wound up essentially equipping a small experimental analysis of behavioral laboratory, and then started doing work on operant conditioning. And that was my first introduction to behavior analysis in any form. And that was now 1956, 57, 58, those years. And I was at Hopkins, as was Bernie, until 1965 when we moved to Rochester. So that's a short answer, long short answer.
Well then, how were you trained as a behavior analyst?
Well, I had no training as a behavior analyst. There was no one doing training. Even Skinner didn't actually train anybody. He was noted for the fact that when a student went to Harvard, they were essentially shown what's happening there, but not told what to do. It was their job to figure out what to do for a thesis and so on. They took a few courses. Because Skinner, in fact, did what was done to him and what he thought was good for a graduate student, just to leave them alone. If they can't figure out what to do, then discard them. So there was no training. I never had a course in behavior analysis. But it was a time of great ferment, and so there was a lot of just self-training. But my training came in part by just reading some of the people who are here today. It's interesting that the choice of people that are chosen for this program, in all 4 of the cases, are people who have had profound influence on my life. And I prepared for this interview in part by looking back at that instance, and maybe just give you a feeling for what it was. Joe Brady was important because he was running. He had gone to. He was a regular Army man, and was at Walter Reed in a marvelous situation where a boss. He will probably tell you the story about David Rioch, and he put together a group of people in sort of what's called neuroscience now. A physiologist, anatomist, Murray Sidman, and put together a group of people who were involved in animal behavior work. And so he was a model for a large group of people, and he was a marvelous. He didn't teach anyone anything, but he was just there, and you saw what was happening, and you emulated it. And Murray Sidman was there, for instance. He had already published a few articles in Science, and he had one article on technique for studying sort of temporal duration and timing and behavior in rats, and used the DRL schedule. And so I saw that, and I was interested in sort of time, more or less, and I wound up doing a study in time. You know, you just grab another. Where's somewhere here? I put this down here. Here's a. I don't know how we can show this something or other, but we could interpose this later. Here's a paper from Science in 1955, November 11th, 1955. Technique for assessing the effects of drugs on timing behavior. And it starts off actually talking about how before a drug can safely be recommended for relief of a specific physiological malfunction, it must be checked for possible deleterious effects upon other systems. Careful consideration must also be given to the possibility of toxic effects upon normal adaptive behavior. Normal adaptive behavior, that's behavior. Particularly in the case of those drugs that are known to produce behavioral changes, and then in view of the importance and so on and so on. I was, you know, in a situation where I wanted to study behavior and drugs. I was in a division of clinical pharmacology, so that's a method for doing it. So Bernie Weiss and I did published a few years later. Effects of alcohol on timing behavior. He had included alcohol and amphetamine in his study of timing behavior, and so we did it. And we did it in humans as well as in rats, and went on. And in the case of timing, in the case of DRL performance in the rat, it was very interesting that the rats are always active in a situation. They're hungry. They're looking for food. More formally, they would have been deprived of food, and now were doing things that got reinforced by being successful. We ran into one rat who was nibbling his tail every time he'd work on the TRL 20-second thing. He'd press the lever and either get a pellet or not get a pellet. Then he'd go over to the back of the cage and essentially look at do his tail. What you do to an ear of corn, nibbling along, and then he'd run back to the front of the cage, press the lever, and so it looked like the doing was being trapped in by the reinforcement of the press, which occasionally was reinforced if you had waited 20 seconds. And so a chain of behavior, or time, a length of time was being reinforced, basically. But what is time? It was length of behavior, actually. Anything else? So we published a paper in JAB, overt mediating behavior during temporally spaced responding. Well, this was Murray again, remember? Because he touted us on to a method by just publishing in Science. So that was the kind of tutelage we had. And then, a few years later, we published a computer analysis of serial interactions in spaced responding. And then further observations on overt mediating behavior and the discrimination of time. Well, that's Murray. That's Murray and Joe. Now, you chose Jim Holland to be in this series. Jim Holland is an interesting guy who, again, he got no training much in behavior at the University of Virginia. He'll tell you, I think. But he wound up wanting to work on vigilance behavior in humans. It's a question of attention. When does an animal, when does a human attend to what you're doing? If you're dealing with someone who has the task of monitoring the world and sort of seeing something like a lookout on a ship, You're supposed to be looking out, making sure that you in fact see whatever you're supposed to be seeing. You know, how do you keep the person to keep doing that? Well, it occurred to him, and he had just a little bit of reading and everything else, that this is a behavior that could be essentially put on the schedule of reinforcement, which is what he did. And he published a little piece in, again, I think he'll probably tell you about this, that he wound up talking to Murray Sidman, and wound up publishing a short paper in the first year of publication of the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, JAB. And then he published as an important piece in Science. It was a lead article in Science, and back then, a lead article in Science was a very important thing to do. And he had a 6 or 7 page paper on human vigilance. The rate of observing an instrument is controlled by the schedule of signal detections. Well, that was very interesting. And again, we wanted to do human work in back at Hopkins, and we picked up his method. And his titles were Human Vigilance, Technique for Behavioral Analysis of Human Responding, another paper, Counting by Humans on a Fixed Ratio of Schedular Reinforcement. And these were in Science and in JAB. And in 1960, we published an article called Human Observing Behavior After Signal Detection. And a couple of years later, we published Effects of a Concurrence Task on Fixed Interval Responding in Humans. And a few years later, we published Response Cost and Confirming Behavior. And these all followed actually from work he had done. We were using the same procedure, which was having you put a person in a situation where they're supposed to detect a movement of a needle on a gauge. And so once in a while, this needle goes off to the side, and they're supposed to push a button. But you put them in a dark room and make it so they have another button, which they can get a flash of light with by pressing. So they're pressing one button to get a flash of light, and they're not keep pressing it, they can press as much as they want. That's the operant behavior they're interested in, actually. And they go over and reset the needle if it's moved over. You make the resetting, say, once every minute, and you get behavior that's FI behavior. You're very slow. Pause after the reinforcement, and probability of the needle having come up again gets higher as you get closer to the end of the minute. And so we were working on that, and then suddenly we discovered that we sometimes they'd make responses on the left-hand lever, and then when they catch the stimulus of the needles flipping over, they'd reset the needle, and then they'd go press again though. And that was a strange thing. We discovered that we had apparatus difficulty, and sometimes they would press, if they didn't press enough, the needle actually wouldn't reset. So they were checking to see whether the needle had it reset when they did the resetting response. Well, that was interesting. That's a fascinating behavior. That's like a confirming response, which you see this in life. You press when you mail a letter. You can find them to drop mail a mailbox nowadays. They've almost been abolished because of 9/11. You very frequently will put the letter into the over it, put the letter in the box, close it, Then go back, make sure that it dropped down. After all, the box could have been full, and your valued letter could be still stuck on the top of the bunch of letters and so on. So this is not obsessive compulsive behavior, but it feels now like a clinically interesting thing. So anyway, we published this was like response cost and confirming behavior. Anyway, so Jim Holland was important to us. And John Catania, in a sense, remade my life. But in 1966, by that time, I was on the editorial board of JAB. JAB started. You know the story.
Tell it. People
like Joe Brady and Murray Sidman and other younger, Charles Furster, Bill Morse, Dick Rinstein, and so on. People around Columbia and Harvard laboratories who were involved with Skinner, Fred Keller, and Nat Schoenfeld in studying operant behavior were annoyed occasionally when the paper that they sent into an APA journal, such as the Journal of Comparative and Physiological Psychology or the Journal of Experimental Psychology, got handled by a reviewer or by an editor with disdain. The methodology wasn't the classic methodology that you'd see in most of the other papers in the journals at the time, where emphasis was placed upon doing an analysis of variance, of taking data, sort of small amounts of data from a large number of people, say. And here they were dealing now with a kind of behavior where you could see changes in an individual organism that were lawful, and it's actually easy to you could easily see a change especially on a cumulative record. You could actually see the change in real time. So Charlie Furster was the lead person into saying, essentially, we've got to get ourselves a journal. And by 1957, there was enough interest in this that they, in a classic meeting in the Statler Hotel, the group decided to go ahead and, in fact, publish a journal. And I was nowhere around that time. I mean, Murray Weiss and I were still at Hopkins, and sort of off on the side, sort of the group that was forming this stuff, which was a New York-Boston group, basically, and mostly students of Keller, Schoenfeld, and Skinner. So they put together a journal. We started ostensibly in January of 1958. I think the issue came out the first issue came out in April of 1958. And after a few years of the journal, both Bernie and I were named to the editorial board because we had already been publishing in the area. By 1966, I was, I think, a good reviewer. In large part because of my, in a sense, ignorance of the field. So I could react to articles with a more of, what's that? Demanding more clarity, sort of. If you have a certain degree of ignorance is good in a reviewer. If they know too much, then they may not do a good review of the article. They won't improve the article or anything else. By 1966, the first editor had been Charlie Furster, then a student from Columbia who had gone off to Boston, to Harvard, to work for Skinner, work with Skinner. And he was the person who in 1957, after being there for about 3 or 4 years, published with Skinner, first the book Schedules of Reinforcement. He had been the first editor. The second one was John Boren, another Columbia person who had wound up at Walter Reed eventually, and then with Joe Brady. The third article, the third editor was Nate Asrin, who was a student of Skinner's. And then the next editor was I guess the next okay, then it was it was a 3-year term at the time. So it's 58, 59, 60, 60, 61, 62, 63. Yeah. The next editor, John Bourne had asked me whether I was willing to stand, and I thought it was crazy, but when after sort of a sleepless night, I said yes, I would. And he had also asked Charlie Catania. And Charlie at the time was 29 years old. I was 39. So I, in a sense, I wound up getting into this thing, you know, after graduate school. When I finished graduate school when I was 28 years old. So, but anyway, and Charlie and I sat outside together, talking about the journal and everything else, and while the members of the board of the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, which was essentially the first editorial board of JR, were deliberating. They chose Charlie, which was a relief to me, actually. But I was really very interested in the sort of business end of the journal by that time, also, and a mutual friend, and one of the people actually in the room there, Peter Dews, suggested that we sort of maybe do it together. I could do the business part, and Charlie would do the editorial, be the editor basically. And so I wound up being named the executive editor. And Charlie was the editor, and that worked out fine. I really enjoyed running a little business. My father was a businessman, and so I had a sort of a good feel for what was needed, and so we wound up doing it together for 3 years, and then Charlie was succeeded by Stan Puskov as editor, and someone in there. Anyway, by 1974, 1972, the committee choosing an editor suggested that I be editor again. By this time, I was ready for it, and so I did it. Actually, I did it for 4 years because the person who was succeeding me had a sabbatical coming, Mike Zeiler, and so it was extended a year, and that's after another one. It was one more 3-year term, and then it was decided to make it a 4-year term. So I was editor from 73, 74, 75, 76. But at the end of that, I just went back to being executive editor. And I've been there ever since. So in a sense, Charlie really was very instrumental in doing that. So the 4 people that you wound up selected just right.
Good. What do you consider your most important contributions to behavior analysis, or what would you like to be remembered for?
Oh. Well, I don't think I'm not a heavy hitter. I don't think in this area. In the science, I think I've done a few good things. I mean, if I had to tick off, you know, 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever things that I think were good, good papers. So one is that overt mediating behavior on and timing stuff, and I think that was a good paper. Bernie Weiss and I collaborated for about a decade while at Hopkins, very actively. We actually had like a 10-year postdoc experience, because we were in first in the division of clinical pharmacology in the Department of Medicine, and then after a few years in the Department of Pharmacology, and did some nice work on various areas, partly just following our nose, partly by chance. For instance, we did work on behavioral thermoregulation, where a rat or any other animal could press a lever and get heat for a few seconds. And the trick was to put the animal in a cold room, and we wound up doing that just because we had designed 6 little rooms in the Department of Medicine. By little room, I mean room the size of this area here, which is maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. We had 6 of them. One of them was an animal room, and one of them was sort of like a little meeting room, and one was a experimental room, and then 2 of them were offices. And that was 5. The 6th was probably another experimental room. They took one of them away from us when building the building and made it into a cold room. So when we learned that, we decided to pick up on something that Bernie had gotten involved in at the School of Aviation Medicine, namely having an animal pressed for heat in the colds. A fellow named another psychologist down at the School of Aviation Medicine actually started that stream of stuff, and then had left the place. So we wound up doing some work on behavioral thermoregulation, which was interesting stuff. And then we wound up to work on titration behavior. I saw an ad in Science from a group of the lesser-known drug houses that put out over-the-counter drugs, mostly painkillers and things like that. They had money to spend on research, everything else. We put in for money, and the first money we actually got independent of the grant of Lula Sanya that had been that was actually supporting our salaries, was $4,000 or $5,000, which we used for setting up some shock procedures for rats, where they could titrate how much shock they took, because the shock went up and down depending upon whether they stopped working. It would go up every few seconds, and then they would push it, and it would go down a little bit every time they press the lever, and so on. Anyway, so we did some work with titration behavior like that. So we had those 2 things going concurrently, and then we had the human stuff going concurrently on mediating behavior and stuff like counting behavior rather in the Holland type stuff. And we also would be running. We were running many experiments at the same time because we had lots of time. Our only commitment to teaching was giving a lecture or two in the pharmacology course for medical students. So we had these sort of 3 or 4 or 5 different streams going at the same time, and it was just great fun. And then so a lot of that was I think fascinating. But we wound up getting more and more involved with behavioral pharmacology then, and also got involved now with some of the management of it, because the Behavioral Pharmacology Society was founded also about 50 years ago, in 1957. In fact, the Behavioral Pharmacology Society, the meeting that led to the start of the Behavioral Pharmacology Society was one night before the meeting that led to the start of the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. and by and large, sort of overlapping groups and so on. I enjoyed that kind of interaction in some of these organizations. One thing we started doing near the end of our time at Hopkins, maybe halfway through, we started working on pigeons. I was also, and I thought that I took the lead on work on what's called stimulus control, and its influence on drug performance, and so we had several papers in the Journal of Pharmacology. Concurrent to all this was we were both involved with the Journal of Pharmacology, which was a fascinating journal, started in about 1909. Just celebrating its centenary. Founded by a professor at Hopkins, and John Jacob Aveling. So Bernie actually became the second field editor for behavioral pharmacology, and I was on the board for 10 years, and that was a good experience. But so of the stuff that came out of the pigeon lab, I think I did 2 good papers out of it. One of them on fixed interval schedules, and serious control, and another one using the fixed consecutive number schedule, and so I thought that was good contribution. But I'm not one of the giants like Murray Sidman, who really is something.
Well, that's your view.
Something else. That's my view.
But that wouldn't necessarily be a popular held view, I promise.
Well, then the other interesting thing happened here, and this was very indirectly now, I guess, by Charlie, because of my sort of intimate organization, intimacy with JAB, really, was the beginnings of the website. And that, I'm very, very proud of that. I think that website is just great, and it's been great fun. And so that, in my dotage, that's what I've been doing mainly, and taking lots of pictures, because ever since I was an undergrad, I was a high school student, I've been taking pictures. So I enjoy taking photographs of all sorts of things. Like what? Oh, on my home territory, I'm in the Department of Environmental Medicine. I'm sort of the house photographer. So I, for instance, take there's a seminar series that the students go to, and I take a picture every Monday at noontime during the spring semester. I'll be there taking a picture of the person doing the presentation, and usually by the next morning or two, I'll put it up on the web for the department and so on. And I've taken lots of pictures of people in this field, actually. over the years.
You ever take pictures at ABBA?
Sometimes I have been. I've been taking them at Squab.
Yes.
Squab Society does quantitative analyses of behavior, meets for like a day and a half or two, just before ABBA.
Right.
And I started just 3 or 4 years ago, when I noticed no one was taking pictures, and so I started taking pictures. I find especially as I get older, I really don't like to sort of sit still for an hour listening to a talk. If I'm not really, really involved in what's happening, having a camera gives you an out. And I can go to Squab, for instance, and I sort of, if you have a camera, you have the run of the place. I remember once being in Norway at a outdoor festival where I came late to it, and all the seats were taken. But I noticed there had been a bunch of people right at the arena in the center, sort of, where people were dancing and so on. Photographers. I had a camera with me, so I just walked down the aisle, joined the photographers. So the photographer, I can do that at ABBA, at Schwab, and I wind up, I usually lying down on the floor, practically in front of the person giving the talk. And it's great fun.
Jeff Michael does
but
that.
If you have to sit still through a talk, and it's difficult to walk out on someone, and you can't do anything else. You're sort of left with your own devices. It's not very good. So anyway, so it's good being the photographer in some ways. You're thought of as part of the furniture, so other people don't see you in a sense. So.
Okay, well, you go to the next question. How do you think behavior analysis has changed over the years of your career? It's a good question.
Well, it's certainly the applied behavior. The applied behavior is in better shape than the experimental analysis behavior for many reasons, actually. Partly pressures against using animals has certainly hurt. Especially small schools will tend to not want to get involved with rearing problems. It's expensive. You have to hire a vet, for instance. When Bernie and I were at Hopkins, we had a back room the size of half of this room here, where we kept our rats and pigeons, and had a person come in from the vivarium who would clean them once a week. It was a very smelly place, everything else, but there was no control over the animal at all. You didn't have to justify yourself. Now you have to, before you can do an experiment, you have to justify yourself through a committee and so on. And it was thought to be much more difficult to use animals. So that area is not prospering as much as the applied area. That can be seen in the circulation of the journals, for instance, where JABA has at least twice the circulation of DAB. I think lots of very nice things are published in JAB, right? But I think that's one sea change. So has been the growth of the applied area. That seems to be very healthy now. Yeah, that's.
Okay. Is there anything in your career you would do differently?
I mean, if I had to do it over again. So.
Yeah.
Well, I've been very lucky in my jobs, in the sense that which is like 1 year at Brown, 10 years at Johns Hopkins, and then from 1965 on at Rochester. and I've actually worked in I have the same office that I started in at Hopkins. After they were building a building at Hopkins, at Rochester, when we moved up there in 1965. But we moved into a new building in 1966. I am still there. It's a delightful spot, partly because it's on the ground floor of the building, partly because there's a parking lot attached to the building, which essentially was almost part of our department when we moved in, and so I still have a parking space there. I'm one of the few people in the world who can see his car from his office. Not many CEOs can do this, make that statement. So it's delightful, and so I'm less than 20 minutes away from home, and so I've been, I think, very lucky in my choice of jobs. It's been pleasurable. My day job has changed in some ways. I'm in the Department of Environmental Medicine, and the one task of the department is to run the PhD program in toxicology. I'm not a toxicologist. I have some skills in, say, behavioral toxicology, but these are not the behaviorist type. So I sit through lots of talks where I don't understand what's happening. I had enough skills as an administrator so that I wound up directing the toxicology PhD program for 13 years, which was actually great fun. I first was acting head because the person who was directing the program moved somewhere else, and then after 6 months I decided I like this and let me continue for a long time, and so I did that until almost retirement time. So I had a day job that was pleasurable and didn't interfere with more important things like dealing with JAB and so on. I wouldn't trade much of what I've done for some other stuff, other job.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
What areas of the field would you like to see more work done in?
Well, human operant conditioning is I suppose I'm not sure how much it's thriving. And I must say I don't. I don't know what the figures are now for JAB's proportions of human versus pigeon versus rat, for instance. But I'd like to see more human operant conditioning.
Why?
Well, you always want to make the leap from the animal to the lower animal to human, and you want the brightest of the bright to in fact get into the area, which is very important, and devising new methods and so on is always important. But
what do you see as the future of behavior analysis?
well, it seems to be bright. It's difficult. When I worry about, say, the reduction in the number of in circulation of the journals, for instance, I'm always impressed by the fact that while we're losing subscribers fairly regularly over time, the APA journals are losing subscribers even more. Now, it's a Schadenfreude kind of thing. Yeah, you know, I'm not unhappy as a longtime member of APA. I shouldn't be happy for them losing subscribers. But what's happening is that the internet is becoming more and more important, and so it's becoming less and less important to even to have a subscription or to go buy the back, for instance, sale of back issues of JAB are way down because we remember just several years ago now we arranged to have all the issues, all the back issues of JAB and JABA scanned in by the National Library of Medicine. And now, if you go to PubMed Central, you can go to you can go to like 6,000 articles from JAB and JABA and just get them instantly like that. So we shouldn't be surprised if we essentially are doing ourselves out of that particular part of the business. And yet, as someone who loves paper, I sort of hate to see the paper version of the journals decrease in sales.
But you're also saving the environment when you.
Oh, we don't cut down many trees.
Okay. What message would you like to send to students of the future?
Work hard. Work smart. Pay attention to what you take the tough courses. Take the courses that you can't make up. I have been handicapped in much of my work because I don't have a good background in chemistry, and I would have been better off taking that early on. There are some things that are very difficult to make up for after you're 25, 30 years old. So, in a sense, run toward the stuff that may be the most general stuff 10 or 15 years later in your field. Now, the trouble is, you never know ahead of time what the heck you're going. What is your field? Where are you going to be? Because most of us can't plan more than about a semester ahead. So it's awfully difficult to go ahead and answer a question like that for someone else. But basically, I think it is good to go toward the tough stuff and the basic stuff that you'll have trouble with. Take that math course.
Could I ask one question that isn't on the list?
Absolutely.
Who do you see, and I don't know whether this is politically correct or not, but who do you see as stepping up to not replace, but to become the leaders in our field in the future?
Well, there's
in both areas, applied and basic.
Well, I shouldn't mention names.
Okay.
But there are several programs that are generating some very fine behavior analysts, I think ABBA is doing. ABBA, I think, is a well-run organization, and is doing, I think, a very good job supporting the program and so on by having, actually featuring them at the meeting and so on, and this works very well. So I think, in terms of organizations, I think we're in good shape. I think that ABBA and the program certainly is superb now.
They're reaching out internationally.
They're reaching out internationally. They're now at the position where both the behavior analyst and the analysis of verbal behavior are going to be presented through the PubMed Central National Library of Medicine program. So their stuff's going to be scanned in and available to everybody. I would probably do a few things differently than Abba doing them, maybe, with regard to the journals. Part of things and such things as just plain pricing, but you know, by and large, they're well run. I'm proud of. We had a paper in the Behavior Analyst. It's a good journal now. It really has gotten to be very interesting. I'm sort of sorry it's not coming out more times per year. I think maybe they should go to it, 3 times a year instead of 2 or something. I wish the Human Journal would be better off if they came out thinner, but every 6 months. It's just a year is just too much to demand of a person who's trying to wants to publish a paper. If he misses the deadline for this article, this issue, has to wait 1 whole year before it'll come out. So it's more likely that they'll do something else with it. So I think that they'd be wise to change that. But by and large, I'd probably not to actually become involved with the other journals because, in a sense, there's a little conflict of interest here, and I probably shouldn't have an opinion on these things anymore.
Okay.